are immediately surprised by the ball's lack of weight. No matter, you'll make it work.
Part of finishing Disco Elysium and moving to its subreddit comes out of that need to expand your knowledge of both the game and its themes. A major factor in that being the attempt to continue the high you've just come off of in other forms of media. Luckily, there are both official and unofficial sources that give you plenty of references for continuing your personal political vision quest of any of the subjects heavily mentioned in the game. Many of those take the form of posts asking, "Please give me another hit of that good shit," followed by a dozen recommendations, and others take more official form, like this dev blog post that references over a dozen inspirations and recommendations directly from the developer team. But it's difficult to find any one piece of media with absolute parity to Disco Elysium. Not many of the titles can provide the same tipsy-turvy, politically fueled amnesiac police investigation that Disco Elysium can. One of the first choices I consumed off this list was a book titled The City and the City by China Mieville, which was a pretty engaging piece of weird fiction that followed some similar beats to Disco Elysium with its noir murder mystery in a strange and psychologically confusing city. What's curious to me is that for years after reading, I assumed that The City and the City was a direct inspiration and influence for Disco Elysium, as believed by many others who read the book. But as to lead designer and writer Robert Kurvitz and the influence he felt from China Mieville, he said, "When I read his stuff, I think, yeah, I'm way better than this." Wait, hold on. Did I just hear that the guy who's most responsible for this game's creation, who without participation would not have a concept at all, actually dislikes the author I thought to be essential reading? It's a bit of a tailspin, but I guess it's not exactly hard to believe. Robert Kurvitz began his development of the world of Elysium in the year 1999, far before The City and the City was released in 2009. Of course, the world of Elysium seen then wasn't the same that we saw 20 years later in Disco Elysium, because Kurvitz developed his world as most do. With age and maturity comes different interests and ideas. Kurvitz himself claimed that the world was a bootleg Finnish Middle-earth roleplay system, which isn't exactly on par with what is seen in the release of the game in 2019. That being said, as shown in the developer blog, it is claimed that it's a glimpse into some of the media we like to consume. This actually grants pardon to Kurvitz's statement, as this could reference the entire dev team or several of the other key members of the game's creation, like head of art and design Alexander Rostov, or any of the 4 key writers besides Kurvitz. But really, any of the staff who worked on the artistic elements of Disco Elysium could be responsible for getting the credit to appear. But the fact that it appears at all when one of the heads of development has clearly stated it's not an inspiration, when it very much claimed to be so, leads me to wonder how cohesive any of the inspirations and themes of the game can be. I discovered this little contradiction while doing research for a different topic about Disco Elysium, and it made me want to take another look at some of the pieces of media that claim to be Disco Elysium-like, and also throw in a recommendation of my own. Because even though most of the creations in this video are of solid quality, I believe it's important to note that nothing is just like Disco Elysium. Going back to The City and the City for a moment, I thought it was a genuinely great book, and while I see similarities in its opening styles, I can tell where the inspiration ends. The book opens on a sad Eastern European-style crime scene, with a murdered, unidentified woman dumped in a courtyard found by kids looking for drugs. It really runs with the gritty, sad world that Disco Elysium also uses, but props up with its art style. The main character is a detective, and his case takes him all across the city visiting all types of factions and people. But besides a beautiful setting and interesting hook, the story has a bit of a slow pace and quickly draws away from the more humorous and quirky characters of Disco Elysium. And although the main protagonists of both titles are anything but similar, they both continue a certain persistence in solving their cases, regardless of how much certain factions would rather have the death go unsolved, or better yet, forgotten entirely. What may go unnoticed from a read of The City and the City, and an interesting fact about Mr. Mieville, is that he is an ardent socialist, which plays out more vocally in one of his other books, Kraken, a fantasy set in London, which among other things features the Workers' Union of Familiars, which are on strike for most of the book for better working conditions. Kraken is an extensive book on its own that covers a lot of ground in not a lot of time. The main plot revolves around a mystery of who stole a gigantic dead Architeuthis, but it quickly dives into its magical world that somehow seems more politically rooted in everyday politics than real life does, featuring factions of religious cults, government agencies, Nazis, gangs, and businessmen. Despite that the city in the city is claimed to be a good starting place for China Mieville readers coming from Disco Elysium, most likely due to the strange setting and murder mystery plot, it actually seems to me that Kraken features more of the similar themes of Disco Elysium, but as far as I know, it's not been widely mentioned. To enter the city of Martinez, where Disco Elysium takes place, is to be fully immersed in politics, one way or another. Even the people who choose not to choose must make that choice, and by that extent, join a faction, lest you get the boring cop achievement, which is only contrasted by the comedically strong politics you get involved with going any other way, those being the communist, the fascist, the moralist, and the ultra-liberal hustlers. It's not drastically important to know going into Disco Elysium that the game was made by a bunch of Estonian communists, but it will help you remember why you're such a fucking dweeb if you go down the fascist path. Contrasted to the red-hot politics shouted from the walls in Disco Elysium, literally in some cases,
Good idea, piggies. Run along now. Fuck her shit up good.
is one of the other games on the list of inspirations and recommendations, Kentucky Route Zero. Its similarities are numerous in the wide scope, but the ways it is conveyed textually is very different. At first glance, it appears to be a sometimes isometric, sometimes side-scrolling adventure game with lots of dialogue padding that weighs heavy on your reading eyes, but the people of Kentucky Route Zero aren't the strong-willed, politically savvy members of the left or right. Sure, they have their beliefs, and I'm sure if you spent a few years shooting the shit with them, you'd eventually hear them slip out something about something, but mostly the characters you meet will fall into that gray area of lower middle-class people trying to survive in a gently sinking economy. Unlike the city of Revachol, that violently went from suzerainty to commune to occupied territory, Kentucky Route Zero still takes place in the United States. The people have just enough to worry about personally that they won't try to point blank you in an argument about communism versus capitalism. It's a quiet suffering, one that preludes the boiling over emotions in Disco Elysium, and because of that, it also lacks some of the absurdist humor and fiery personalities that fans of Disco Elysium may seek out in other works. Where Kentucky Route Zero puts the American culture front and center, allowing you to read much further into the personal lives of your characters, Disco Elysium puts the here and now first, leading you to talk about situations at hand, rather than the distant personal lives of its characters, like Tommy Leon, who can only be led to spill his guts about his home life through an empathy check. Furthermore, it doesn't declare itself an RPG as does Disco Elysium. It's fundamentally a walking simulator, a picture book, except the pictures are attached to 5-paragraph essays. Your dialogue options, while you can pick them, don't really matter in the effect they have on the game. Rather than the characters learning who you are, you end up learning far more about yourself if you take a moment to think why you're choosing what in a game where choosing really doesn't matter. You can get similar experiences playing both games, but your emotional mileage may vary. Ultimately, Kentucky Route Zero chooses to take a much less literal approach to challenging the status quo. Despite the fact that you spend much of the game in a magical realist cavern system, trying to deliver antique furniture to one house that seems ever elusive while seeing and hearing things that seem just a little out of the ordinary, everyone is still a slave to the system. Rent is due, my credit card bounced, we're gonna have to let you go. You're not solving a murder, you're looking for home. I've always tried to put Disco Elysium and Kentucky Route Zero in one little basket, but they're not identical. Because while they both have you running around reading a shit ton of words about politics for 20 hours, one drives a knife into your heart, and the other just slowly suffocates you. Culturally speaking, it's the European style versus the American. Placed on the list of television inspiration for Disco Elysium are two shows I hold in very high regard, True Detective and The Wire, and both have strong reasons to be on the list. But what surprised me was the lack of one show in particular, one that held a strong similarity in Disco Elysium superficially, if not thematically, Twin Peaks. One of the issues I have with bringing Twin Peaks into the mix of already superb cop shows mentioned prior is the chance of just pure coincidence writing. Sure, both Disco Elysium and Twin Peaks feature a cop pair in a small struggling town dealing with a murder mystery featuring a quirky out-of-place cop and a more serious grounded partner, while also including a number of highly surreal dream sequences, but to claim those features alone give them parody would mean that a movie like Dread could also have disco inspiration. What really gives media similarity is in their thematics and stories, regardless of what the setting and characters are. Still, it's fascinating just how similarly FBI agent Dale Cooper acts to our very own Tequila Sunset, enrolling just the most insane Inland Empire and logic checks, while doing some seriously good detecting. But more prominently asking is whether or not Twin Peaks holds some of the political and philosophical questionings in its subtext as Disco Elysium holds in its forefront. As hard as it is to believe, Twin Peaks, released in 1989, does not feature any communist sympathies very prominently in the show, nor does it ask the viewer to consider if the failed communist uprising that overthrew the local tyrannical government only to then be overthrown by a union of moralist countries was the fault of the communist, fascist, or moralists. While I'm smudging a bit more sarcasm in than I need to, it's important to understand that while Disco Elysium can toy with the very fundamentals of its political and cultural history, most TV shows lack the budget for such events. True Detective, The Wire, and especially Twin Peaks make up for such events by choosing to focus on smaller scale politics instead. After all, that's what politics is, choosing how to treat and care for one another, right? Even though the status quo in Martinez is not shaken nor disturbed by the murder of one man, it becomes a catalyst for a much larger event, the Tribunal, that is only brought on by indeed another larger event, the Union Strike. By that extent, the murder is quite important, but unlike that, in the small city of Twin Peaks, it is immediately and drastically affected by the death of local high school student Laura Palmer, and even though her death never results in a military tribunal that results in a shootout, it certainly shakes the local politics of the city. At no point is the audience asked to rebuild communism or become ultra-liberal businessmen, but instead to look at local politics and relations, and how single fracture point incidents can have rippling consequences. What people can lose focus on in Disco Elysium through some of its more grandiose and delusional characters is that the whole game does in fact take place in a small shithole city, and whether our protagonist wants to accept it or not, it's important to take local factors into account, and not get too caught up in building 0.0001% of communism. What's important to note, I believe, is that due to Disco Elysium being a true-to-life RPG, you are able to take away pretty much whatever you want from the game when you beat it. I think the reason there are so many Disco Elysium video essays all trying to pick away at the same topic of what's this game about is because it's supposed to be a deeply individualistic experience. Despite the writers and developers of the game having strong biases towards more communist-oriented ideas, they don't stray away from plot threads relating to both corruption and actual legitimate union-sponsored assassination. Nobody gets to be the good guy. Not even your character. Even if you play him 100% clean as a whistle, he's hurt other people before the game ever begins. To create any piece of media that's just like Disco Elysium would be in its own genetics copying the RPG elements and freedoms that Disco Elysium has. To connect to any character to the same degree as your very own detective is to remove much of the semblance of personality that makes other pieces of content interesting as a look into the life of a different person. Hell, maybe that makes the Fallout games or any other roleplay game with a large variety of choices more similar to Disco Elysium than any of the aforementioned titles. You can find duplications of books, movies, and non-RPG video games because the archetypes present in each form of media are just that, archetypes, and writers can often find similar ground to cover from story to story they create for said media. But RPGs are unique in that each playthrough is different as far as one player wants to make it, and most certainly between different players are different beliefs, playstyles, and choices. Not to say that the takeaway from non-RPG content is all the same either. People take away a wide variety of messages all consumed from a single piece of content. It's what we stumble across that shapes our perspective of the story, and just like missing the entire church quest or acing the missing husband case, you shape your own future and past from it both consciously and unconsciously. If you want a fun detective case set in a very interesting city with tons of intrigue and noir, The City in the City is your call. If you want all the politics and culture that comes with the city of Martinez made a little more low-key and chill, Kentucky Route Zero is there for you. And if you want the fun and weird characters peppered throughout your playthrough, Twin Peaks is a solid bet. But none of those will completely fill the void, because none of them were meant to. They will only add to the longing of Disco Elysium because nothing is meant to shape up to the strange things you'll see on your first run. What makes a game experience unique is in its impossibility to replicate, and anything intentionally trying to do so could just as easily slip into being a soulless ripoff. The differences aforementioned in each piece of media are essential in distinguishing themselves and their themes from each other and providing an experience unlike anything else. Again, this is not to say these are bad content. Each one will give you a different perspective on a certain aspect of Disco Elysium. So try all of them. Try none of them. Find broadly what you liked about Disco Elysium and narrow it down. Be open to more worlds, more creators, and more ideas. And sure, take recommendations, but be wary of trying to find any product that is superficially similar. Where Disco Elysium thrives is in its own rigorous self-critique of politics and people. Because perspective is an innately human trait, the desire to see the bigger picture, and only through seeing from the eyes of many, many people can you develop beliefs that you can reasonably call your own. It's hard to find something that matches that love you feel for Disco Elysium, and maybe that's a good thing. Nothing should start with that bias, and maybe through dozens of books, movies, TV shows, plays, paintings, and video games, you'll find something that's just like Disco Elysium.